Welcome to The Midpoint, conversations with the extraordinary people building the American innovation economy from the inside out. I'm Patrick McKenna, founder of One America Works. Welcome to The Midpoint. I'm Patrick McKenna, founder of One America Works and partner at Comeback Capital. Today, I'm joined by Steve Case. To this audience, really no introduction needed. CEO of AOL in the past, Rise of the Rest fame, Revolution, big advocate for investing in the heartland. And more than that, really an example of somebody, coming from Hawaii, not exactly Silicon Valley, and starting a business that really defined the industry and then setting up shop in Virginia and then, turning your experience and your network to helping other people rise. You recently wrote the book, Rise of the Rest. I read it. And I just want to say, I thought I knew a lot of stories about people and places, and you captured so many awesome stories. So just really congratulations on the book.
Well, thank you. That's why I wrote it. I just realized I've had the opportunity the last decade to travel a lot of cities, meet a lot of entrepreneurs, and I go back and talk to people about it, and I had no idea that was happening there. I had no idea this company was starting, or no idea this entrepreneur existed. And so I said, well, I got to document this. I got to make sure people everywhere understand what's happening all across the country.
And not coincidentally, maybe it is coincident, not sure, but we're in Cleveland. Yep. And the book starts with you in Cleveland. And so it's been a while since you started kind of the Rise of the Rest adventure. Can you talk a little bit, returning to Cleveland, what has happened in the last 8+ years?
No, it's a great example of a rising city where a decade ago, most people around the country, and frankly, most people even in Cleveland, didn't really think there was going to be much in terms of startups, innovation, entrepreneurship, job creation, investment, et cetera, which is why a lot of people grew up here, went to school here, left to go to other places, kind of a brain drain. But you've seen steady progress over the last decade. We've seen that even in some of the research we did with PitchBook. Said that in the last decade, 1,400 new venture firms have started and Rise the Rest. Even I was surprised by that number. It's oh, that's great. So how do we make sure those, even if some of them are kind of small, they have success and get to be larger? And that, I think, can have a really transformative impact. So that's been helpful. The pandemic, in an odd way, has been helpful. It sort of created this unlock in terms of where you live and how you work. And it led to some people to move to other places, some people to boomerang back to places they're from, some investors, as you know, in places like Silicon Valley, suddenly paying attention to what's happening in Ohio or other kinds of places, because if it's a Zoom pitch meeting, it doesn't really matter as much where they're based. It's also, we've seen some public policy around some big issues like decarbonization, supply chains, semiconductors, regional hubs, that also is creating an acceleration. So, compared to where we were a decade ago, or kind of felt like the early days of the internet when we first got started with AOL, and only 3% of people were online. Most people were is the internet ever going to really be a real thing, or is this going to be a hobbyist thing? In the early days of Rise of the Rest, I kind of saw similar skepticism in people's eyes, but now people are more intrigued, where they're starting to see more successes. I think it'll just accelerate over the next decade.
So I've been seeing it personally, and even when we kind of talk about with the One America Works network, is that I've been an entrepreneur multiple times. My most recent, I started 15 years in Silicon Valley, but my most recent company was started in Baltimore. We did it in 2016, and everybody was like, "You're crazy. Why are you starting a company in Baltimore?" I'm like, "Well, Hopkins is there, T. Rowe Price, Legg Mason. There's amazing. We're doing a fintech company." So the fintech talent that we're going to need to scale this business is there. And then I'm like, Stella Corridor, you can be in New York where the money is in 2 hours and a half an hour in DC. This is 2016. Everybody thought, again, this is crazy. But then you say the pandemic has a silver lining. We had an office in Baltimore. We always wanted to be hybrid. Pandemic happens. We went full virtual. And so now we have 250 people in the company. The company's called Facet. It's financial planning. Just completely, with 39 states, we have people in it. And now everybody says, wow, of course you started a company in Baltimore.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Oh, of course you had Zoom built in your original product, right? So it's kind of become this default. Of course, you're going to have some hybrid or some remote work. You're seeing this across your portfolio?
Yeah, absolutely. There's some that are fully remote. There's some that actually are fully back in the office. They just prefer working that way. But most are some version of hybrid. And that just creates more flexibility for people and how they work, as I said, but also more flexibility in terms of companies, how they start and how they scale, which I think will advantage these Rise of the Rest cities.
So you mentioned earlier that we're at a critical moment. We're hitting some critical mass, some things come together. Can you talk about that? I'm feeling it as well, yeah. but you're deep into it. So could you unpack that comment?
You talked about some of it, but you have to break it into pieces. I think that what's happening in these rising cities is we've seen steady growth and interest and investment and so forth over the last decade. But the tipping point was an accelerant, no question. There's growing recognition that the innovation, the puck is shifting in a different direction, and sectors like healthcare and food and agriculture and others are kind of up for grabs. And partnerships matter to be successful in those because it requires systems level kind of change. And a lot of big partners in healthcare, take here in Cleveland, the Cleveland Clinic and university hospitals, super, credible partners. And suddenly there's an advantage, like you said, with Baltimore and Johns Hopkins to be in one of those,
and their
cities.
culture's changed a little bit too, right? They're being more willing.
The bigger companies and the larger organizations are recognizing they need to be more agile. They need to be thinking more entrepreneurial. They need to be working with some of the startups so they can understand what's happening and be part of that change, not be caught by surprise. So that's been a positive factor. And also, everybody criticizes Congress, but they did pass some legislation, mostly in a bipartisan way, last year, including the CHIPS and Science Act, that did some things around reshoring semiconductors, but also is basically allocated $10 billion for regional hubs. And so there's also a recognition from a public policy standpoint that the innovation economy is shifting and America needs to shift with it. And to make sure we lead the way again as the most innovative nation in the world, but also we do it in a more inclusive way. More people in more parts of the country can be part of that as opposed to feeling kind of left out and left behind.
So adding geography to the inclusivity.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? One of the things that I think is on this list, a muscle or a superpower or some capability that didn't exist before the pandemic that I think has shifted everything is remote due diligence.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it used to be that like a big investor, I only invest within a drive for a board meeting. And there was all these biases against companies that weren't in that location.
Right.
And then for 2 years, big money investors didn't need any of their investments, whether they were in San Mateo or in Cleveland.
Right.
So that's a capability that didn't exist before. Do you see that as one of the things that's just not going to change? And now money can actually diligence operations? And
I think it'll be a mix. I think for sure more investors started looking at other places. Some because the economy's tightened and the venture world has kind of gotten a little more cautious and risk averse. Some that were doing experiments other places may pull back and just go back to focusing in their geography. But I think the majority realize they're great entrepreneurs building great companies everywhere. And they'll continue. And once they make an investment in a city, whether it be Cleveland or Detroit or Atlanta or what have you, they then, not surprisingly, learn about other companies. And one becomes 2, which becomes 5. And suddenly they have a little bit of a regional cluster. I think that dynamic will continue to accelerate. So I'm pretty bullish about what's likely going to happen over the next decade or so.
And this moment feels, in your view, it's quite broad. It's not just the Austin, the Salt Lake, and Denver or something like that.
Yeah, no, it's dozens of cities. We've now done our bus tour in nearly 50 cities. We've made investments with our Rise to Rest fund in over 100 cities. I think it's 38, 39 states, something like that. So this is a broad-based phenomenon. And part of what's going to be interesting, even to me, is 10 or 20 years from now, what are the cities that have really capitalized on this moment and really are kind of the next big startup hubs? I have a theory on what some of them might be, but I think I'll be surprised because some of the ones that have momentum now might lose it, and some that are just gaining momentum now could really accelerate. And it's why I just, kind of with audiences like we have here in Cleveland, just urge people to think about it as a moment, that something has been bubbling, a bunch of forces are now converging. If it's something you've been watching over the last 10 or 20 years, now's the time to really recognize there's something much more fundamental going on.
Without calling it short, who would you say the city that is like the non-obvious long? So there are some obvious ones. So like I said, Salt Lake, Austin, something like that. What's one or two that might not be on people's radar?
I always duck that question. It's kind of like asking who your favorite child is. Or now my favorite grandchild, because I have a few grandchildren. No, we really try to celebrate all these cities. And I don't believe it's one or two. I really do believe it's going to be dozens that really rise up and surprise the world.
So the other thing I loved about the book was you mixed in like a lot of technical stuff along with the stories, like the 3 C's, capital, community, and communication, celebration, right? And the 7-spoke network. I like to think in terms of frameworks. We talk a lot about like the trust network and like Silicon Valley being a trust network where like if you worked at Google or you were funded by Sequoia or you went to Stanford, you're kind of qualified in. And then looking at like that ecosystem thing, if a capital, an entrepreneur, and the university, these are like a trust network where people kind of lower friction. Is this one of the reasons why more people are getting access to this? Is that you can, like Salesforce can acquire ExactTarget in Indianapolis. extend the trust network into Indianapolis. Now there's 5,000 people who work for a Silicon Valley company. Like, is this part of the
Yeah, it's part of it. It's part of it. And we have made progress, but I'd say that's an area where we need to make more progress. That trust network, that network density in Silicon Valley, that sense of possibility in Silicon Valley does not exist in most parts of the country. And so how do the universities in these different cities partner with the big companies in those cities, with medical research operation hospitals, others in those cities, and collectively do things that nobody can do on their own, and start building up more of that network density in more places. Hopefully people will recognize this really as a moment and seize it.
And definitely the who's my favorite child question, but I think there is an important question I'd love to get on the table of like what can go wrong? Like where's like a place where, like, if we don't capitalize the success, you were talking about venture capital. Right. I worry about this too. Everything is risen, but when things start to pull back, does it kind of pull back in disproportion to Silicon Valley, or does it pull back in proportion, or does it disproportionately stay out in kind of new places? Is there something on your radar that you're kind of watching to say, hey, let's just take a look at this so we can capitalize on our gains?
Well, I think capitalizing on gains, going back to the exact target mention you had with Indianapolis, is in many of these cities, we're starting to see some companies emerge as sort of significant tentpole companies. How do we make sure we fully capitalize on it? I think it's hard to get those going when you do have one. How do you build some momentum around it so it leads to dozens of other companies and lots of other venture capital being created as part of that. So that's one area where I think there's some risk. And then also making sure, as given this talent equation is in flux, some people during the pandemic did move some other place. Are they going to stay there? Are they going to move back to some other city? Are more people going to move there? Just trying to make sure you have an environment that is welcoming to people, connects people who do move to a city or move back to a city so they feel part of that community, including part of that startup community, I think is a big opportunity. And then with the investors, going back to what we said before, if they have made an investment in a city like Cleveland or some other city, how do you make sure they see other potentially interesting deals so they double down on that city, as opposed to say, well, it's kind of was an anomaly, just did that one investment in that one city, I'm going to pull back and just invest in my own backyard. So
in kind of conclusion here, it's like success begets success. Yes. And so I want to just wish you the most luck on the success of your book.
Thank you.
Because I think it really does define so many people have been working. I would say it's the 10-year overnight success. Right. So people are looking at the IPOs happening, and you have there were some in Atlanta that surprised me. Like, I didn't know MailChimp was in Atlanta.
Yeah, MailChimp was sold for $11 million.
There's some really big successes that took 10, 12 years to develop. And I would say, let's celebrate the book. Many people kind of get convinced. And then hopefully it's not 8 years more before we're back in Cleveland.
I look forward to it. And I really don't even think of it as my book. I think of it as kind of our book. I'm trying to tell the story of the work you're doing and so many other people are doing all around the country, and celebrate that work and celebrate those entrepreneurs and celebrate those cities and just try to be a champion, a cheerleader, so all these cities can rise up.
Well, thanks so much for all your work and sharing your views with the audience. Thank you so much.
Good to see you.
Appreciate it. To learn more about One America Works, visit our website at oneamericaworks.org.